His was not a career of glamorous flight against glorious sunsets. He was the guy who showed the world how to organize and conduct massive airlift operations. In the early days of World War II, he took a chaotic aircraft delivery system and made it into, in effect, the world's largest airline. He tripled the amount of men and materiel the Army Air Corps carried over the hump into China. With nuclear war looming, he kept Berlin alive under Soviet blockade for 11 months, importing by air everything that millions of people needed to survive. And when North Korea invaded the South, he organized and commanded airlift for the Far East forces that prevented an American Dunkirk at the Pusan perimeter. Within a 7-year period, he had organized and managed 3 airlifts that changed history. He is Lieutenant General William Tunner, and he is a legend of air power. William Tunner was born on July 14, 1906, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He was one of 5 children, the son of Austrian immigrants who had entered the United States through Ellis Island.
He enjoyed hunting and fishing and with his brothers and his dad. And his brothers and sisters went on to college, and it was his turn to go, and being the youngest. And in the beginnings of the Great Depression, he elected to go to West Point.
The 1920s were pivotal to air power. The Air Corps was then a part of the Army, and the primary doctrinal debate going on within military circles revolved around the effectiveness and role of aircraft in battle. Tunner, as a cadet, absorbed much of that debate and came away with a strong belief that air forces were critical to modern battle. He graduated in 1928 and chose the Air Corps as his specialty. He trained in San Antonio and was stationed as a second lieutenant to Rockwell Field in San Diego. Assigned to ferry a small transport north to Sacramento, the young pilot was stunned to find the craft filled with passengers.
They looked at him, and he looked at them, and they expected a grizzled old pilot with wrinkles at his corners of his eyes, you know, and weathered grayed hair and so on, but not the shiny young guy that was before them.
Flying troops was not something Tunner had considered. Responsible for the lives of a dozen passengers, flying a plane he had never flown before over country he had never seen, he navigated with a Rand McNally road map spread across his lap.
So that was the beginning of air transportation as far as he was concerned. And from then on, he was interested, of course, in the concept of air transportation as well as other things. His assignments took him into air transport.
Tunner moved through a variety of jobs, and on the eve of World War II was in Washington, writing orders to move aircraft from one place to another. To break the monotony, sometimes he'd assign himself to ferry a plane from base to base. After the outbreak of the Battle of Britain, General Hap Arnold informed President Roosevelt that the United States lacked the ability to ferry aircraft and other materiel across the Atlantic. Roosevelt ordered the Secretary of War to correct that deficiency. The presidential order worked its way down the chain of command. Tunner became the second employee of the new Ferrying Command. They plotted air routes across the North Atlantic to England and across the South Atlantic to the Middle East. As the number of flights grew, so did the amount of chaos. The Ferrying Command needed a base, and one day when his commanding officer was away, Tunner asked the acting chief of the Air Corps if they could perhaps have the Long Beach Reserve Base as their own. Close to the factories producing the planes, the move would enable the Ferrying Command to more efficiently manage their pilots. Stunned by Tunner's question, the general agreed to assign the base to the Ferrying Command. Tunner was in Long Beach when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He put out word that he would hire any qualified civilian pilot. I had the idea, he said, that they would rather deliver planes for us than be drafted into the infantry. Within 6 months, he had hired 3,500 civilian pilots. He tore apart the existing highly centralized command structure and dispersed authority to local commands. In charge of domestic operations for the Ferrying Command, he was fiercely dedicated to his men and his mission, and more than a few people thought him arrogant. No matter, Tunner got things done, and the men under his command came to think of themselves as an elite within the elite Air Corps. By mid-1942, hundreds of aircraft a month were pouring off assembly lines, and Tunner's team got them to squadrons all over the world with an efficiency that amazed officers and civilians long resigned to the hurry-up-and-wait norm of military life. Always searching desperately for pilots, he discovered that one of his friends was married to a woman who regularly flew herself from Baltimore to Washington in a small plane. Unaware that General Arnold had already rejected pilot Jackie Cochran's plea to allow women pilots to fly military aircraft, Tunner and Nancy Harkness Love drafted a plan to hire women pilots as civil service employees that General Harold George quickly approved. The Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron began delivering planes in the fall of 1942, freeing up hundreds of male pilots for combat duty. Between June 1942 and June 1943, the Ferrying Command delivered 3,600 planes to overseas destinations and completed almost 55,000 domestic movements. Ferrying Command pilots flew 75 million miles. The next year, they did twice as much. By the time Tunner was summoned to Washington in May 1944, Ferrying Command had more than 50,000 people working for it. If I had to go anywhere, General William Tunner wrote, why of all places did it have to be the hump? The China-Burma-India theater, as the hump was more formally known, was the closest thing the Allies had to the Germans-Russian front. It was the war's backwater, the hell, or at least purgatory, of jungles and impassable mountains.
It was an incredibly challenging operation because he was having to coordinate flights over the Himalayan mountains, which were 500 miles long and 3 miles high and subject to some of the world's most extreme weather conditions.
By keeping the Chinese army supplied and fighting, the over-the-hump flyers were tying up millions of Japanese troops who would otherwise be free to fight elsewhere. Tunner arrived in India in August 1944. He commandeered a C-46 and flew the route himself to see what his men were dealing with every day. For more than 3 hours, 550 miles each way, he and his crew flew over mountains pocked with craters from crashed transports. Tunner, who understood well how critical the hump mission was, brought with him a crack team of managers and engineers. They gathered performance statistics that showed where the problems were, the bases that need extra attention. They established maintenance centers that repaired planes on a kind of assembly line. And they upgraded search and rescue operations to the point where pilots knew that if they went down, they had a fighting chance of surviving. While his officers did all of that, Tunner himself went to work upgrading his command's living conditions.
Food, warmth, clothes, medical care, interest in their families was paramount, and this was right in tune with his interest in the mission. If you took care of your men, then the mission would be accomplished with a group that had good morale.
I think you had people that were trying to, again, apply a Band-Aid to the situation and hope for the best. You got Tunner in there, and you got somebody who was a true leader and had the ability to take command and to really apply the necessary logic to this and to conduct it like a true military operation instead of just a stopgap measure to help these guys through a certain period of time.
He discovered men who had served their tour but never been rotated out. And despite his desperate need of experienced crewmen, put them on planes headed for home. He looked out at his exhausted pilots and he cut the number of hours they had to fly a month, which cut the rate of pilot error. He declared war on mosquitoes and had his men strip B-25s and fill them with pesticides to spray from above. Known among his men as Willie the Whip, he was a regular on all 19 bases under his command, setting higher and higher standards for everyone, whether a loadmaster or PX officer. He badgered Washington for supplies and was rewarded with fresh uniforms and toiletries so that his command could shed its disheveled appearance. And then he marched them every Saturday, turning a sorry lot of jungle loafers back into soldiers. The transformation was nearly miraculous. One base went from an average of 30 flights a day to 81. In September 1944, Tunner's first full month in India, his planes carried 22,000 tons over the hump. In November, it was 35,000. And by July 1945, it was more than 70,000 tons. To celebrate Armed Forces Day in August, Tunner's command orchestrated one of the most amazing feats in military history. Using C-46s, C-47s, and C-54 aircraft, planes barely larger than a modern commuter airliner, they flew 5,327 tons over the hump, an average rate of one plane load every 72 seconds. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, said this about Tunner's efforts in China. Certainly no more prodigious example of strength, science, and organization in this class of work has ever been seen or dreamt of. With the war over, Tunner's flyers went to work bringing POWs and other American internees out of what had been Japanese territory, while continuing to bring in supplies and administration. Tunner considered going into business with Hap Arnold, setting up a cargo airline using military surplus transports, but decided instead to stay in the service. He took a desk job at the Pentagon and became deputy commander of the newly formed Military Air Transportation Service, fusing the transport capabilities of the Air Force and Navy into one. In Europe, what had been a power-sharing agreement between allies had turned into a face-off between new enemies. The Soviets on one side of the line were open in their desire to dominate Europe. The Americans, British, and French on the other were committed to preventing that domination. On June 19, 1948, the Soviet commanding general in Berlin referred to Berlin as part of the Soviet occupation zone. The next day, the Soviets began tearing up railroad tracks and building blockades to make that statement real.
We had to make a statement to Stalin and to communists in general that this kind of aggression was not going to be tolerated and that they could not have a domino effect, which of course was the objective. And we needed to take action immediately and definitively, and we needed to show them that we were going to support our allies and that we were not going to allow communism to overtake any more of Europe than it had already consumed.
Behind closed doors, President Truman's military advisors advocated sending an armored column to break the blockade. Diplomats inquired whether Great Britain would allow the United States to base nuclear-armed aircraft in England and launch strikes against Eastern Europe from English soil. Berlin had 30 days' supply of food and fuel, at which point the United States would have to either fight or surrender. To give Truman more time, the Air Force started flying essential materials into the city. The city needed 7,500 tons of supplies a day, including coal to fire its electrical generators. Under Curtis LeMay, the airlift built to 2,500 tons a day, a frantic pace that seemed unsustainable. There were no schedules, no standard procedures, none of the tools Tunner had used to build the capacity of the hump Air Force during World War II. With the clock ticking down to a nuclear confrontation between East and West, the lessons of India and China seemed to have been forgotten.
You had millions of people living there who were unable to get supplies, food, the basics needed for life. Well, obviously, being an ally, we couldn't allow this to happen. And so America and England and France began fishing around trying to decide what we could do.
A month after the airlift started, the Air Force ordered Tunner to Berlin. His job this time? Give President Truman all the time he needed to prevent a nuclear war. Tunner reassembled as much of his World War II team as he could and set off to confront a new set of problems. Not only did he have to supply a whole city, he had to do it through only 2 airports in Berlin. When the Berlin Airlift started, there was no one who believed that it would be possible to supply all of Berlin's needs by air. When General William Tunner and his staff arrived, they quickly assessed the situation and went to work.
It was going to be necessary to coordinate a tremendous number of flights on a daily basis in order to drop enough food and supplies into West Berlin to help these people stay alive and outlast Stalin's effort to strangle them.
Willie the Whip revised procedures at the only 2 air bases open to Western aircraft, Tempelhof, the American base, and Britain's Gatow. Crews, which had previously lounged around the ready room while their planes were unloaded, were ordered to stay with their planes and take off the instant they were ready to go. Tunner noted that the distance to Berlin from the British sector of Germany was shorter than from the American, and moved as much of the loading operation as possible to British bases. That alone increased by nearly 50% the number of runs the planes could make. In August, bad weather stacked planes up in the very limited airspace over Berlin. Tunner, who was on one of the transports, watched as air traffic managers lost control of the situation. One plane skidded off a runway and crashed. Another landed on a runway under construction and ground looped. Up in the clouds, planes had to veer to avoid mid-air collisions. Disgusted, Tunner got on the radio and ordered everyone back to their home bases and instituted a policy giving planes only a single pass at landing. If they couldn't, they went home fully loaded. But the planes coming behind them had safe skies into the runway. From all over the world, Tunner requisitioned and received C-54s, the largest transports running at the time. His command celebrated Air Force Day in September the way they had celebrated Armed Forces Day in India, by organizing a record-setting day of incredibly hard work. The airlift that had seemed chaotic, moving 2,000 tons a day in July, moved 7,000 on September 18th, and averaged almost 5,000 by October. Tunner announced the construction of a new airport in Berlin and began hauling materials to build it. The first plane landed there in November. It was fully operational a month later. In the background, negotiations between the Soviets and the United States continued. Nuclear-armed B-29s were moved to England within striking distance of targets in the Soviet Union. Plans were drawn up for an invasion of East Germany. What kept the nuclear trigger from being pulled was, without question, Tunner's airlift. It made clear to the Soviets that America's hand could not be forced. With the whole world watching, Stalin was unwilling to start shooting American planes out of the sky. As the blockade dragged on, Tunner put on another of his fantastic shows, an Easter Sunday orgy of transport that moved almost 13,000 tons of supplies into the supposedly cut-off Berlin. The Easter Parade, as Tunner called it, broke the Soviet will, and a month later, they ended the blockade. Tunner's team had flown more than 250,000 supply sorties. Tunner received the Distinguished Service Medal. He and his men were named Aviation Men of the Year by the Air Force Association. On the way home, he stopped off and met the King and Queen of England. He returned to the United States and his job at the Military Air Transport Service. He was looking forward to spending time with his family and appalled to find that the prevailing mood of the country was to cut the defense budget. It seemed a sad irony that he seemed destined to preside over the dismantling of an air transport system he had helped build. He was fishing in Alaska, contemplating his future far from telephones, when the North Koreans swept into South Korea. He hustled to Tokyo on an inspection tour, and there learned that he had been put in charge of the airlift that was the last American hope for holding on to the tip of the Korean peninsula. He was told the assignment would last 2 months. The Air Force set up the Combat Cargo Command for Tunner to head, giving him equal standing with the tactical commander. He moved supplies to Busan, allowing the perimeter to hold, but spent the bulk of his time planning the airlift portion of General Douglas MacArthur's invasion of Incheon. The invasion went beautifully. His planes delivered the 187th Airborne and all its equipment, and with the same clockwork regularity they had shown in India and Berlin, set up operations at the captured Kimpo Airport. He organized the first full-scale medical airlift capability, and MacArthur awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross for his orchestration of a paratroop drop that resulted in the killing or capture of more than 6,000 North Korean troops. When the Chinese Communists counterattacked, entrapping the 1st Marine Division at Chosin Reservoir, Tunner's planes flew in supplies and flew out wounded, enabling the Marines' heroic march to the sea and rescue. 6 months after arriving in the Korean theater, Tunner's 2-month assignment ended. He turned the airlift over to a man he had trained and returned home. He retired in 1961 after testifying before Congress about the future of military air transport. Representative Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Special Subcommittee on Air Transport, ended the hearings by saying, "General Tunner, we commend you for a job well done."